The Christmas lights were still blinking when my son said it. I remember the way the living room looked that evening. The tree we had all decorated together 2 weeks before. The gold and red ornaments my late wife Carol had collected over 30 years of marriage. The garland draped across the fireplace mantel that I had climbed a step stool to hang because my son's back was bothering him again. The smell of the prime rib I had spent the better part of the afternoon cooking filled every corner of the house. I had gotten up at 5 that morning to season it, to let it rest at room temperature the way Carol used to, the way she said her mother had taught her. I had set the table with the good china, the white set with the blue rim that we only brought out twice a year. It was the kind of Christmas evening that looked, from the outside, like everything a man could want. I was 64 years old. My name is Walter Crane. I had spent 31 years as a civil engineer for the state of Oregon before I retired, and in all those years I had built a reputation as a man who could look at a problem, a crumbling bridge, a failing drainage system, a stretch of highway that kept flooding every spring, and find a solution without losing his composure. My colleagues used to joke that I had ice water in my veins. I always took it as a compliment. What I had not engineered, it turned out, was my own family. My son Marcus was 37 that Christmas. He had my height and his mother's eyes, and when he was small, he used to follow me around the garage on Saturday mornings, pretending to help while I worked on the car. I used to let him hand me tools he didn't know the names of. I used to call him my little foreman. When Carol got sick, when the diagnosis came and the months started collapsing into each other the way they do, Marcus flew home from Seattle, and he sat with me in the hospital waiting room for 8 hours straight without saying a word. Just sat there. I loved him for that more than I could ever say out loud. He married Diane 4 years after his mother passed. I tried, from the beginning, to love her the way you love someone who makes your child happy. She was sharp and pretty, and she laughed loudly at her own jokes. And in the early years, there were moments when I thought we were going to be fine. When their daughter, Sophie, was born, I drove 14 hours from Portland to Seattle, in one shot because Diane's own parents were overseas, and Marcus had called me at 2 a.m, his voice cracking at the edges, saying the baby had come early and he was scared. I held Sophie in the hospital while Marcus slept in the chair beside the bed, and Diane recovered. She weighed 5 pounds and 11 ounces, and she had the thinnest fingers I had ever seen on a human being. I sat there in that hospital room in the blue light of early morning, and I thought, this is what it is all for. Every early morning, every late night, every bridge I drew up at my desk, every penny I put away, all of it had been pointing to this small, perfect thing in my arms. I would have done anything for that little girl. And I did. When Marcus and Diane decided to open a restaurant in Portland 3 years later, I thought it was a good idea. Marcus had always loved cooking. He had his mother's instincts in the kitchen, that ability to taste something and know immediately what it was missing. Diane had the business sense, or so she said. What they didn't have was capital. I co-signed their SBA loan, $240,000. I signed my name on that document on a Tuesday afternoon in a conference room that smelled like carpet cleaner, and I did it without hesitation because Marcus was my son and I believed in him. I also quietly put in $60,000 of my own savings as their startup cushion money I had set aside over years. Money from Carol's life insurance that I had been careful with, that I had told myself I would only spend on something that mattered. That was in the spring. By the following January, they had moved in with me. The restaurant had run into trouble almost immediately. A contractor dispute that tied up their kitchen build-out for 5 months. A key chef who quit 2 weeks before opening. A soft launch that got a mixed review from a food blogger with 40,000 followers, which in this day and age is apparently enough to put a shadow over everything. Marcus was devastated. Diane was furious, not at the circumstances, I noticed, but at Marcus, in the quiet, particular way that some people are furious at the people closest to them when the world doesn't cooperate. I told them they could stay as long as they needed. I had the room. The house was a 4-bedroom Craftsman on the east side of Portland that Carol and I had bought in 1998 and paid off over 20 years. It was more house than one man needed. I converted the downstairs guest room into a bedroom for Sophie, and I put a new mattress in the master suite for Marcus and Diane, and I moved myself into what had been Marcus's childhood bedroom. It felt right. It felt like what a father does. That was 14 months before Christmas. During those 14 months, I watched my savings account the way you watch a tide go out. Grocery bills. The utility costs that tripled with 4 people in the house. A new furnace in October because the old one gave out during the first cold snap, and I couldn't have Sophie sleeping in a cold house. I covered the car insurance when the restaurant's business account ran dry. I babysat Sophie 3 days a week so Diane could go into the restaurant to try to turn things around, and I picked her up from kindergarten on the other 2 days and took her to the park and helped her with her reading. She was learning to sound out words. She used to bring me her little books and sit beside me on the couch with great seriousness, running her finger along the lines, and I would tell her she was the best reader I had ever known, which was not entirely untrue. I did not ask Marcus for rent. I did not ask Diane for grocery money or a contribution to the utilities. I told myself that they were going through enough. I told myself that when things stabilized, we would sort it all out. I told myself this was temporary. What I did not tell myself, because I was not ready to hear it, was that somewhere along the line, I had stopped being Walter Crane, the man who built things, and had become something more like a fixture in my own house. The shift was gradual. It happened in the way that water finds a crack in concrete slowly, invisibly, and then all at once. I noticed it first in small ways. The way Diane changed the thermostat settings without mentioning it. The way she rearranged the kitchen cabinets one afternoon while I was out, moving everything to positions that made no sense to me, so that for 3 days I kept reaching for a coffee mug and finding pots and pans. The way she spoke to Sophie in front of me about plans and schedules that I was not part of, not unkindly exactly, but with a completeness that made clear I was not expected to participate. The way Marcus sometimes looked at me at the dinner table with an expression I could not quite read, not quite guilt, not quite irritation, something in between. I told myself it was the stress of the restaurant. I told myself Marcus was tired. I told myself this was what it looked like when families navigate hard seasons together. There was an afternoon in November, about 6 weeks before Christmas, when I was in the kitchen making chicken soup Carol's recipe, the one with the dill and the homemade stock, and Diane came in from outside, still in her coat, and walked past me to the refrigerator. She opened it and stared into it for a long moment. Then she closed it and said, without looking at me, "We're trying to eat cleaner. I'd appreciate it if you asked before you cook things like that." I stood there with a wooden spoon in my hand. I didn't say anything. I turned back to the stove and I lowered the heat under the pot, and I thought very carefully about what I was going to say before I said it. "This is still my house, Diane," I said, "and it's my kitchen." She left the room without responding. I didn't sleep well that night. The weeks between that afternoon and Christmas were uncomfortable in the way of things that have not been said. Marcus and I had a conversation once, in the garage, where he told me that Diane was going through a lot, and that he hoped I could try to give her space. I asked him what that meant, specifically, in a house that belonged to me. He said he just meant emotionally. I said I thought I had been very patient. He said he knew. We stood there among the tools, and the storage bins, and the old cardboard boxes from Carol's things that I still hadn't been able to go through, and neither of us said what we were actually thinking. I bought Sophie a wooden train set for Christmas. It was expensive and beautiful, and came in a box that took me 40 minutes to assemble on Christmas Eve after everyone had gone to bed. I set it up under the tree with a little village around it, a station, a water tower, a miniature mountain tunnel, and I sat back on my heels in the dark living room with the tree lights blinking, and I thought it looked just right. Christmas morning was good. Sophie woke at 6:30 and stood at the top of the stairs in her pajamas, screaming about the train set in a volume that I was fairly certain the neighbors could hear. Marcus came down still half asleep and laughed at the sound of her. Diane made coffee. We sat around the tree and Sophie tore through her presents with the specific intensity that only a 5-year-old can bring to gift unwrapping, and for a few hours I let myself believe that everything was fine. Dinner was the problem, or rather, what happened after dinner. I had cooked for 3 hours. The prime rib came out exactly the way I had intended. A deep brown crust, pink and perfect inside, resting on a cutting board while I finished the horseradish sauce and the roasted vegetables and the Yorkshire pudding that I had learned to make from a video online, because Carol had always made it and I had never paid close enough attention. Sophie had set the table herself, very proudly, with only minor silverware confusion. We ate together, and it was, genuinely, a good meal. Even Diane seemed relaxed. She had 2 glasses of wine and talked about a catering idea she had for the restaurant going into the new year. Marcus talked about a contractor who had come in under budget. It felt almost normal. After we cleared the plates, I went to the kitchen to start on the dishes. I have always done dishes after a meal. It was something my own father did, and I picked it up without noticing, the same way you pick up the way someone walks, or the words they use when they're tired. I was at the sink when I heard Marcus and Diane talking in the dining room. Their voices were low at first, then less low. I turned the water off. "He's always here," Diane was saying. "Every day, every meal, every evening. There's no space, Marcus. There's no space in this house that's ours." "He lives here," Marcus said. "It's his house. I know whose house it is. That's the problem." A pause. "I love him. I do. But I need to be able to breathe. I feel like a guest. I feel like I'm being supervised." "He's not supervising you. He moved his things around in the study last week. He reorganized the garage. He makes suggestions about Sophie's bedtime, like, I don't know my own daughter's schedule. I can't do this forever, Marcus. I cannot do this forever." There was quiet for a moment. I stood at the sink with the water off and my hands still wet, listening to the sound of my daughter-in-law explaining why I was a burden in my own house. Then Marcus said something that I did not expect, even then. "I know," he said. "I know. Maybe we need to talk to him about making some different arrangements." Diane said, "Maybe what would be easier for everyone is if he found his own place." I turned the water back on. I finished the dishes. I dried my hands on the kitchen towel. I went to the living room and I sat with Sophie while she ran the train set through its loops, and she explained to me very seriously the names she had given each train car, and I listened to every word. When she asked me if I was going to stay for New Year's, I told her we would see. She accepted this the way children accept uncertainty, which is completely, and moved on to explaining the train set. When she went to bed, Marcus and Diane were already upstairs. I turned the tree lights off. I stood in the dark living room for a while with my hands in my pockets. Then I went to my son's old bedroom, my bedroom now, with its single window looking out into the backyard where the cherry tree Carol had planted in 2004 stood bare and still, and I sat on the edge of the bed. And I thought, I am not a man who makes decisions quickly. It is an occupational hazard of engineering. You learn to look at a problem from every angle before you pick up a pencil. You learn that the first solution that comes to mind is almost never the best one. You learn that the quality of what you build depends almost entirely on the quality of the thinking that precedes it. I thought for a long time that night. I thought about Marcus at 8 years old, showing me a drawing he had made of the 2 of us fishing, a drawing in which I was approximately 4 feet wide and sporting what appeared to be a purple mustache, to which I had found so funny that Carol had come into the garage to see what I was laughing about. I thought about the hospital waiting room in Seattle, the blue plastic chairs, Marcus beside me in a sweatshirt, saying nothing, simply being there. I thought about what it had cost me financially, practically, personally, to be the person I had been in this house for the past 14 months. And I thought about whether any of it had been noticed or valued, or even seen. I thought about what Diane had said. Not the cruelty of it, which was real, but the clarity of it. Because there is a particular kind of gift that comes wrapped in something that looks like an insult. Someone tells you the truth about what you are to them, and it hurts so much that for a moment you can't breathe, and then, very slowly, you realize they have also set you free. She had told me to find my own place. I decided that was exactly what I was going to do. What happened over the next 2 weeks, I did with the same methodical attention I had given every significant project of my career. I did not tell Marcus. I did not confront Diane. I went about my days the same as always. I made coffee in the morning. I picked up Sophie from school. I cooked dinner 3 times a week. I stayed out of the dining room when Diane was on work calls. From the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, I was building something. The first call I made was to my attorney, a woman named Patricia, who had handled my estate planning and whose office was in a converted Victorian on the west side of Portland. I sat across from her desk on a Tuesday morning while the rest of the house thought I was at a routine doctor's appointment, and I told her what I needed. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I appreciated about her. When I finished, she looked at me for a moment over her reading glasses and said, "Are you sure?" I told her I was completely sure. She nodded once and pulled out a legal pad. The second thing I did was call a real estate agent named Darnell, who had sold Carol and me the house back in 1998 and had been in business on the same block ever since. I told him I wasn't selling not the Portland house. Not yet. That was a conversation for later, but that I needed help finding something to rent for 6 months. Somewhere quiet, somewhere with a view of water if possible. He sent me 8 listings by the end of the day. I looked at them all that evening in my room with the door closed. One of them was a cottage on the Oregon coast, Cannon Beach, about an hour and a half from Portland. 2 bedrooms, a wood stove, a kitchen with a window that looked out over the beach. Available January 1st. It cost more per month than I wanted to spend, but I had looked at my finances carefully and I knew what I could manage. I called Darnell back the next morning and told him I wanted it. The third thing I did, and this was the one that Patricia had taken the most care with, the one that required the most thought, involved Sophie's college fund. When Sophie was born, I had opened a 529 account in her name. Over the years, I had contributed steadily, quietly, without telling Marcus or Diane, because I had wanted it to be mine to give, my own private gift to her future. By the time of that Christmas, it had grown to just under $70,000. It was untouched. Marcus and Diane did not know the exact amount. They knew it existed because I had mentioned it once, vaguely, when Sophie was about 2, and the conversation had moved on. Patricia had drawn up a document that restructured the account with new conditions. From that point forward, the funds would be held by a small educational trust. The trustee was a childhood friend of mine named Gerald, who had been my college roommate and was now a retired attorney in Bend. The money could not be touched, redirected, borrowed against, or accessed in any form except for direct payment to an accredited educational institution for Sophie's benefit. Marcus and Diane had no administrative access. Sophie would have full access when she turned 18 for any qualifying educational expense. I also wrote a letter. I sat at the little desk in my room on the night of December 30th, with the year nearly gone, and I wrote by hand on paper because I have always believed that certain things require a pen. It took me 4 drafts to get it right. I was not cruel. I was not sentimental. I wrote the truth, plainly, the way you write a report when you want it to be read without confusion. I told Marcus that I loved him. I told him that I was proud of the man he had become in the ways that mattered, and that I knew the restaurant and the marriage and the move had put more pressure on him than any one person should carry. I told him I understood that. I told him I did not say what I was about to say because I was angry, though I had been angry, but because I had thought carefully and believed that this was the right thing for everyone, including me. I told him I was moving out. I told him he and Diane and Sophie could stay in the house through the end of February, which gave them 2 months to make other arrangements. I told him I had already spoken to an attorney and that the house itself was being placed into a living trust with explicit instructions about its future. I told him the details of Sophie's college fund and the new trust structure, and I told him that this was not punishment, it was a gift. The best I knew how to give, the kind that would still be there when Sophie was 18, whether or not any of the rest of this was ever repaired. I told him I was going to the coast. I told him I hoped, when the air had cleared, that we could find our way back to each other, but that I needed, for the first time in a long time, to take care of myself. I signed it, Dad. I folded it in thirds and slid it into an envelope. I also sealed in a copy of the trust documents that Patricia had prepared, the college fund restructuring, the house trust summary, everything he needed to understand what I had done and why. The envelope was thick and solid in my hands. On the morning of December 31st, I was up before 5. I had been packing for 2 weeks in small, careful increments the books I wanted, the tools I couldn't leave behind, Carol's photographs, the good coffee equipment, my fishing gear, the box of her things from the garage that I had finally gone through the previous week, sitting on the cold concrete floor for 3 hours with her scarves in my lap, crying in the specific, quiet way of a man who has been strong for too long. I had rented a storage unit for what didn't fit in the cottage. Darnell had arranged a moving company for the larger items the week before, scheduling them for the 30th, when Marcus was at the restaurant, and Diane had taken Sophie to her sister's house for the afternoon. By the time the house began to stir with the sounds of the morning, my car was loaded and my room was clean. I had stripped the bed and folded the sheets and left them at the foot of the mattress. I had taken nothing from the common areas except 2 photographs from the hallway, one of Carol and me on our honeymoon in Yellowstone, and one of Marcus, at about 9 years old, sitting on the front porch steps with a gap-toothed grin and muddy knees, which I had always loved so much it almost hurt. I set the envelope on the kitchen table. I had written Marcus's name on the front in my clearest handwriting. I put on my coat. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, the kitchen I had cooked in for 26 years. The room where Carol had stood at the stove in her bathrobe on Sunday mornings making pancakes, where Marcus had done his homework at the table through middle school and high school, where Sophie had learned to eat solid food in a high chair I had assembled, with instructions. I'd had to read 3 times, and I looked at it for a long time. Then I picked up my keys and I walked out. The drive to Cannon Beach in the gray morning of a winter's last day was one of the most peaceful hours I had ever spent. I took Highway 26 out through the West Hills and into the Coast Range, the firs standing dark and dense on either side of the road, and the light was that particular low winter light that turns everything into a watercolor. I had the heat on and an old Patsy Cline record playing from my phone, Carol's music, which I had always made fun of and had been listening to quietly for years without telling anyone, and somewhere in the mountains the radio cut out completely, and it was just me and the road and the sound of the tires and Patsy Cline. The cottage was smaller than the photographs had made it look, which I had expected. It sat at the end of a gravel lane about a quarter mile from the beach, surrounded by shore pines that leaned east from decades of wind. The key was in a lockbox on the porch rail, the code sent to my phone the night before. I let myself in and stood in the small living room with its braided rug and its wood stove and its low ceiling and the window facing the ocean gray and wide under the winter sky, and I put my bags down on the floor. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that, because I think people sometimes expect these moments to feel like victory, like the end of an action movie where the music swells and the hero walks off into the light. It did not feel like that. It felt quiet. It felt like the particular quality of silence after you have finished a very long piece of work, not empty, but settled. Like something had been completed. I found the wood stove starter kit in a basket by the hearth, and I built a fire the way my father had taught me. I made coffee in the French press I had packed specifically for this morning. I pulled a kitchen chair to the window, and I sat there with my coffee and watched the ocean move. Marcus called at 11:17 that morning. I let it ring. He called again at 11:40, and again at noon. I sat by the window and drank my coffee and watched the surf break in long white lines against the sand. And each time the phone rang, I looked at his name on the screen and thought about what I would say when I was ready. He texted at 12:30. It said, "Dad, please call me." I read the letter, "Please." I set the phone face down on the kitchen table. Diane did not call. I had not expected her to. I walked on the beach that afternoon for the first time in years. The wind was sharp and cold, and came off the water with that salt weight that fills your lungs and makes you feel, despite everything, undeniably alive. There were a few other people out, a couple walking a large brown dog, a woman in a yellow slicker jogging at the water's edge, but mostly it was empty, which I had hoped for. I walked for about an hour, going north up the beach toward the rock formations that appear on every Cannon Beach postcard, those enormous dark columns of basalt that rise from the surf, like the ruins of something that cannot be named. I had seen them in photographs dozens of times. I had never stood in front of them in person. They were larger than I had imagined. I stood at the edge of the wet sand and looked up at them, and thought about the fact that they had been there for approximately 35 million years. I am an engineer. I cannot encounter a structure without wanting to understand it. I stood there calculating in my head, from memory, the approximate compressive force that a column of that mass exerts on its own base, which is a strange thing to do at what might be described as an emotional turning point in one's life. But I have always found comfort in things that can be measured. Gerald called that evening. I had told him I would be at the cottage by New Year's Eve, and he was checking in the way Gerald has always checked in briefly, honestly, without fuss. We had been friends for 41 years. He had been at our wedding. He had been one of 6 people at Carol's memorial service who I actually wanted to see. He said, "You doing all right, Walt?" And I said, "I thought so." He said, "Good," and we talked about fishing for a while, the kind of talk that is not really about fishing. And then he said, "Good night." I made pasta for dinner. Simple, with olive oil and garlic and a tin of anchovies I had brought from home, which Carol had loved, and which I had acquired a taste for over 30 years of marriage. I ate at the kitchen table looking out at the dark where the ocean was, and I could hear the surf through the walls. It was not unpleasant. I called Marcus back at 8 o'clock that evening. He answered on the first ring. He said, "Dad." His voice had the quality of a person who has been crying and trying not to show it, which is a quality I recognized from his childhood and had hoped not to hear again. I said, "I'm here." He asked me where I was. I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't know it was that bad." I thought about that for a moment. I thought about whether to say what I was thinking, which was that perhaps the problem was that he had not been looking. Instead, I said, "I think we both know it was." He was quiet again. Then he said, "The college fund what you did with the trust that's for Sophie. You don't have to explain that. I understand that. But the rest of it, Dad, the house you didn't have to." "It's still my house," I said. "I haven't sold it. I've told you what the plan is, and I've given you time. That's what I can do right now." He said, "I'm sorry." I told him I believed him. I told him that I was not disappearing. I was not ending anything. I was not turning my back on Sophie, or on him. But that I had learned later than I should have, with more expense than I would have preferred, that loving someone does not require making yourself smaller and smaller until you no longer fit inside your own life. I told him that I had done the best I knew how for him, for more years than I could count, and that I needed him to understand that I had not left because I was defeated. I had left because I was, for the first time in a long time, choosing myself. He was quiet for so long that I thought the call might have dropped. Then he said, "Diane and I are going to go to counseling." I said that was a very good idea. He said, "I should have done better, Dad. I should have. I should have seen it." I told him that we would have time to talk about all of it, that there was no deadline on that conversation, that what mattered now was that we had both said the truth for once, out loud, and that, in my experience in 40 years of structural engineering and 64 years of being a person, the things that are built on honest foundations tend to last. He laughed a little at that. It sounded like him. It sounded like my son. After I hung up, I went back to the window. The new year was still 3 hours away. The ocean made its sound in the dark, that rhythmic, patient sound that cares nothing for calendars or arguments, or the complicated love that exists between fathers and sons. I sat there for a long time with my cold coffee and my thoughts. At midnight, I could hear, very faintly, someone setting off fireworks somewhere up the beach. I went outside and stood on the porch in my coat and watched the colors bloom and fade over the water, red and gold and green, reflecting in fragments on the waves. I thought about what I wanted the new year to look like, not in an abstract way, but specifically the way I had been taught to think. Concrete objectives, measurable outcomes. I wanted to finish Carol's box, the things I had brought with me. The rest of the unpacking I still needed to do. I wanted to fish. There was a charter boat operator in town that Gerald had recommended, a man who ran salmon trips in the summer and crab trapping in winter, and I intended to call him in the morning. I wanted to learn, finally, whether I could cook a really good bouillabaisse, which I had been meaning to attempt for years. I wanted to sit in quiet rooms and read the books I had been meaning to read. I wanted to walk on this beach every day as long as the weather allowed, and some days when it didn't. I wanted, when the time was right and the air between us had cleared, to drive back to Portland on a Saturday morning and pick Sophie up and take her somewhere she wanted to go, and hold her hand across the street and listen to her tell me the names of things. I wanted to stop being invisible. The fireworks ended. The beach went dark. The surf kept going, the way it always does, indifferent and steady and very old. I went inside and washed my cup and turned the wood stove damper down and went to bed in a room that was not mine yet but would be. Outside the window, the pines moved in the wind. The ocean said what it always says, which is a language I was only beginning to learn. I fell asleep before I finished thinking. In the morning I woke to gray light and the smell of salt and a bird I could not identify calling somewhere near the roof. I lay there for a moment, orienting myself. The ceiling was lower than I was used to, the mattress firmer, the silence of a different quality. Then I remembered where I was and why, and I felt it again. That settled stillness. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of it. The foundation poured, curing slowly in the cold air, waiting to bear weight. I put on coffee. I called the charter operator, whose name was Pete, and he answered on the second ring with the unhurried warmth of someone who has nowhere more important to be, which I admired immediately. He said the crab traps were going well this time of year, and that he'd had a boat go out 3 days ago and pulled up more Dungeness than he knew what to do with. I told him I was interested whenever he had a spot. He said he had a half-day trip going out Thursday morning, if I was serious. I told him I was very serious. I made oatmeal. I ate it at the window. On the beach below, a man was walking alone with his hands in his pockets, going south, moving in no particular hurry against the wind. He was about my age, I thought, or maybe a bit older, with the slightly forward lean of someone who has learned to walk into weather. He walked to the edge of the surf and stood there for a moment, looking out at the water, and then he turned and walked on. I watched him until he was gone around the curve of the beach. Then I went to find the box of Carol's things, the ones I had brought with me, the ones I had finally opened. I set it on the coffee table and sat on the rug in front of the wood stove and went through each thing carefully, the way you go through something that matters. Her handwriting on a birthday card I had sent her in 1987, before we were married, that she had apparently kept all those years without telling me. A photograph of her at 22 in a red coat, standing in front of a fountain in Rome on a trip she had taken before she knew me, squinting into the sun and laughing at something out of frame. A recipe card for the chicken soup, in her handwriting, dill and all. I sat with these things for a long time. Then I found a frame. It was a small wooden frame that had held a photograph on her nightstand, a picture of the three of us, Carol and me and Marcus when he was about 4, taken on a camping trip to Crater Lake. Marcus was sitting on my shoulders and Carol was beside me, leaning into my arm, and all three of us were looking at something in the distance. I don't remember what we were looking at. Some bird, maybe, or a cloud formation, or nothing at all. Whatever it was, we were looking at it together. I set the frame on the windowsill where I could see it from my chair. I thought that was a good place for it. I thought that was a very good place to start.